Hi, good morning. My name is Jason Young. I'm the medical director of the Pain Management Center at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I also practice as an anesthesiologist. I get the privilege to work alongside John Chi. And I wanted to talk to you about a little bit of what's going on in the pain world in regards to opioids, and it's a good segue from the bundled payment because there's a lot of things that we can do on the anesthesia side that can hopefully reduce cost and improve outcomes. So there is no doubt that we're in the grips of an opioid epidemic here, where we see the rising tide of opioid-related deaths across the country. However, if you dissect that number further, while we're seeing that rising increase, the number of opioid-related deaths specifically to prescription opioids is declining over the past few years, whereas we're seeing a steep increase in the synthetic opioids and the illicitly manufactured opioids. So what that means is we opened up that spigot for patients, we started exposing them to a lot of the opioids, and then we cut it off because we're trying to do the right thing now, and now patients are going elsewhere to find their source of opioids. Another hidden kind of component to this are the benzodiazepines. And so concomitant benzodiazepines and opioids are related to significant respiratory depression and then eventually death. And so we're seeing a mandate across the pain world of not prescribing opioids with concomitant benzodiazepines. So where that impacts spine surgeons are oftentimes we'll see patients on Valium as a muscle relaxant postoperatively because it is a good muscle relaxant. However, there are other muscle relaxants that we can potentially try as a first line, such as tizanidine or baclofen, to hopefully reduce the concomitant benzodiazepine and opioid use. Now that we have all these patients that are on opioids, how does that impact you as a neurosurgeon or orthopedic surgeon, the spine surgeons? Well, the patients that come in on high-dose opioids are at higher risk for worsened health indices. And so, in fact, they saw that each 10 morphine equivalent increase worsened patient-reported outcomes at 12 months. So long-term sequelae of having preoperative opioids. And that was based off of short-form health survey and then quality of life and ODI. We did a retrospective analysis of claims data on 35,000 joint replacements, and we found that preoperative opioids, and it was a dose-sensitive response curve, increased length of stay, increased non-home discharge, and 30-day readmission. And so that goes into that bundling where if we're able to wean patients preoperatively, then we could potentially be saving the system money on the postoperative period. We also found a higher surgical revision rate and also surgical site infection. So now that we have the patients that we've operated on, what do we do for them postoperatively? Well, if you ask the majority of people how much they prescribe, or their PAs, or the mid-levels, or the residents, a lot of it is based purely off of experience on what people told them to write for. And so we found that 72% of people that were prescribed an opioid don't use that afterwards. And so there's increasing the availability of opioids for no real good reason. When I had my Achilles repair, I had 80 oxycodone and I only used one. And so it just kind of goes to show that we need more consensus on how much to write for patients postoperatively, how much do they really need. So the Michigan Open Project was a project that they use consensus guidelines from surgeons in specific types of surgery. Spine surgery was not included in this, but I think there is room for consensus and developing a guideline on how much for specific types of surgery should be prescribed. The need for objective data is there in that we have sophisticated big data analysis now where we are able to look at trends and machine learning to see how much objectively are patients really going to require afterwards. If they were given 10 pills, did they need a refill versus the patient with 15 pills who didn't need a refill? So then we know that's between 10 and 15. But there are ways that we can hone in on exactly what is the most meaningful, where that meaningful target is to reduce that number that goes unused. One way that we can also reduce the number of opioids out and opioid sparing are the multimodal adjuvants. So anything in pain medicine is always multidisciplinary, multimodal therapy. And so when we look at multimodal adjuvants perioperatively, we find that we're able to reduce the requirement of opioids by giving preoperative and intraoperative medications. So the gabapentinoids, the gabapentin and Lyrica, giving a 300 to 900 milligram dose of gabapentin 1 to 2 hours preoperatively reduced pain afterwards and also improved patient satisfaction and reduced the opioid requirement postoperatively. Ketamine as an NMDA antagonist has also been shown with intraoperative infusions to reduce the amount of opioids that are required postoperatively and also reduce the pain scores. So we're reducing pain scores and reducing the opioid burden on the patient. The alpha-2 agonists, such as Precedex and Clonidine, are a little bit more controversial. We have some signal that's showing opioid sparing and improved pain scores, but there's not enough big data out there to really definitively say that this is the right thing. But the risks are so low that I think it's worth doing it for patients. Lidocaine infusions, it increased cognition postoperatively and then decreased the inflammation and the pain scores from patients while reducing opioids as well. Dexamethasone is a controversial medication in the anesthesia world, and I think the jury's still out there on how much we're able to reduce it. We did see improved pain scores, but we didn't really find any opioid sparing effects with the dexamethasone perioperatively. And NSAIDs, while we did show opioid reduction and improved pain scores, there are a lot of fears for bleeding risk and non-healing that may limit adoption. Tylenol, paracetamol, I think there's very low risk to doing this, and it has been shown. This is a study that they used IV Tylenol in the preoperative in the intraoperative period, and they found opioid sparing effects and improved pain scores as well. Neuraxial opioids, so the idea is if you get exposure and you just do a quick spinal single shot Duromorph, you are able to reduce postoperative opioid requirements, but then you potentially introduce a whole host of other complications, so posterior puncture headaches, potential infection or hematoma. So a big movement in the anesthesia and surgical world is for enhanced recovery after surgery, so the ARIS protocols, or fast-track surgery. The idea is if you are able to reduce surgical stress in the perioperative period, that you're able to increase the patient's return to function and decrease the opioid use, decreasing costs. So there is widespread adoption for the ARIS protocols for colorectal surgery, urologic surgeries, orthopedic, breast, and cardiac surgeries. There's no real consensus on the spine surgery world that I've seen. The idea is that there are multiple components to an ARIS protocol. So that includes preoperative patient education, multimodal therapy that we discussed earlier, minimizing blood loss, early enteral nutrition postoperatively, and early physiotherapy postoperatively. With those components in place, we're able to reduce opioids almost entirely while improving patient function and outcomes. In a study at University of Pennsylvania, they did 200 patients, and they compared that to 75 patients that they did before the intervention, and they found that they had decreased opioid use to almost zero postoperatively, improved mobilization on post-op day 0 and post-op day 1, decreased Foley use, and also just improved pain scores overall at I think 1 or 3 months postoperatively. So there's a lot of room to research here what the exact protocol should be for spine surgery, and I think that'll go into when we are starting to have to bundle and use alternative payment models to figure out what's the right recipe for patients. So in summary, I think it's worthwhile to wean patients that are on chronic opioid therapy prior to surgery. How much to wean them, there's no real golden rule on that, but the idea is just go as low as possible. Setting patient expectations is imperative, and that'll go into the ARIS protocols, but also just for how much pain to expect afterwards. The perioperative multimodal therapy, I think having conversations with the anesthesia team in the hospital to see what is available and what is reasonable for major spine surgeries to reduce the overall impact postoperatively. Avoiding concomitant benzodiazepines, figuring out exactly how much to write for patients postoperatively, and also there's a lot of room for future standardization across the spine world for the ARIS protocols. So the next talk will be discussing what's state-of-the-art in pain medicine now. So going from the anesthesia world to the chronic pain medicine world. We have a lot that we are starting to kind of research, and now we're doing VERTIFLEX or interspinous spacers, CLONIDINE pellets for radiculopathy, and I'll tell you a little bit of what's new in the world of neuromodulation. So VERTIFLEX, the idea is, similar to XSTOP, which everyone has plus or minus experiences with. The idea is that we have a large patient population in between the mild and the severe stenosis. So the mild stenosis, we do the interventions that we typically do. We do the multimodal, multidisciplinary approach to treating these patients, and we do epidural steroid injections. And when they have severe stenosis, we send to our surgical counterparts to do decompression. But there's a big middle ground where people stop responding to NSAIDs and they're not quite surgical candidates. So how do we help these patients? And this fits into that world of that moderate stenosis alongside with minimally invasive lumbar decompression or mild. In our experience, we've found that we've had better results with the Superion VERTIFLEX procedure because with mild, we're having such select criteria that we need exactly ligamentum hypertrophy and nothing else. You can't have any other lateral recess stenosis. So the VERTIFLEX procedure, similar to XSTOP, we're putting a spacer, a mechanical spacer, in between the spinous process. It's minimally invasive. It's a quick procedure, and we can do it under local anesthetic if we need to. Some patients are very motivated to do that because they want to avoid surgery or anesthesia altogether. Or maybe they have comorbidities that are extremely severe, then they want to avoid that as well. We use fluoroscopically guided imaging to do a small, about 2 or 3 centimeter incision to introduce a trocar into the paraspinal muscles. And we are able to do 2 levels with a single incision. The optimal placement is we are placing it in between the affected levels of the spinous processes, and then we push it to the spinal laminar junction. And in the earlier studies where they had it a little bit more posteriorly, they found an increased rate of spinous process fractures. But now that we've started pushing it closer to the spinal laminar junction, we've seen much less. We still have had some, but they're much fewer in frequency. And we can see here that we're posterior to where we would be with mild or some of the other interventions that we do. So they've done pretty robust studies on this that they needed for FDA clearance. They had FDA clearance with a 5-year study that they did for Superion VERTIFLEX, and they followed patients out with 6 month, 12 month, 2-year, 3-year, 4-year, and 5-year data. In that, they found that they had, I'll show you the result in a little bit, but the idea is that they were able to get a CPT code, Category 1, approved for this specific procedure. So at 5 years, they showed continued, durable, robust relief of leg pain. And they found that 70% improvement of their baseline scores at 5 years, and that continued and remained stable over the 5 years. Compared to some of the other things, epidural steroid injections that we'll talk about in a little bit, but stimulators and the mild procedure, we're finding that the Superion is more in line with a surgical decompression. Nothing will replace surgical decompression of a stenotic lesion, but the idea is that if we are finding patients that are not surgical candidates or aren't as severe to require it, then we have a good, reasonable next step. The next thing I'll talk about are the clonidine pellets. So the idea is an alternative to lumbar epidural steroid injections. There's a lot of controversy on corticosteroids into the epidural space on efficacy and side effects and risks for patients, but that's the only thing we really have to do and that we use. And so we are researching clonidine as an alternative to epidural steroid injections. We use clonidine in intrathecal pumps as part of the mix that we do, even though it's off-label. We use it in our epidurals when we're doing anesthesia for any kind of neuraxial relief. And what we found is the clonidine is able to augment the local anesthetic, but also decrease inflammation and decrease the propagation of pain. It's an alpha-2 agonist, so it's decreasing that sympathetic response. We're currently participating in the phase 3 clinical studies to study patients that have subacute to chronic, no more than 9 months, acute radiculopathy of a single dermatome. And the preliminary study data is very positive for this. The idea is very simple. We do fluoroscopically guided interlaminar injection into the epidural space. So we use the exact same kind of TUI needle that we do, but then we put the cap on that you see as the white cap here. And then we use this plunger here to introduce 3 of the micropellets into the epidural space. And then we follow them out for a month. And so it's a 1-month study. After that, they can have whatever intervention they need. But the early data is that we're showing that they are improving in their pain scores compared to placebo. So it's a placebo-controlled study. And the last thing I'll talk about is what's new in the world of neuromodulation. So for decades, we've had a lot of innovation on spinal cord stimulation for hardware, making the leads longer, stretchy, MRI compatible, making the batteries smaller, rechargeable, putting an accelerometer in that. It's always been a focus on hardware. But over the past few years, we've started innovating on software. Nevro came out with a high-frequency stimulator that changed the paradigm in the neuromodulation world. So instead of focusing now on the hardware, we're looking at what is the right software or electricity delivery, almost treating it like a medication. Is it the pulse width? Is it the frequency? Is it the amplitude? Is it the cadence of the wavelength of the electricity that we're delivering? What are we able to do to deliver the appropriate pain relief? And so we're finding a lot of paresthesia free, so or paresthesia independent. So paresthesia is completely on the other side of the body of the affected limb, but they're getting good pain relief on that side. And the jury's still out there. We don't know exactly what that right recipe is for electricity delivery, but it's exciting to see a lot of the innovation being spent on the software so we can figure out what the right thing is for patients. With this innovation in software, we're able to get better control of axial pain for post-laminectomy syndrome. Previously, if we had patients with predominantly axial low back pain after surgery, we would push them more towards an intrathecal pump. And if they had predominantly radicular pain, we would push them potentially to a stimulator. Now we're going more towards stimulator as a first-line option for patients that have post-laminectomy because we're able to get good control of that axial low back pain as well. The other shift that we've started to see is a shift in, it's a hardware innovation, but instead of stimulating the dorsal columns or the spinal cord, we're putting stimulators into the nerve roots, the dorsal root ganglion. And so those are for virgin areas. So if they had surgery, that's a contraindication for it. But for single dermatome or 2 dermatome pain, we're able to put a small, very thin filament into the dorsal root ganglion and achieve stimulation there. There, when we have less CSF, we're able to decrease the amplitude of energy that's delivered and have increased effect. And we're starting to see a lot more high responders that have almost remittance of pain, 80 to 90% relief of the dorsal root ganglion for specific indications. Not really post-laminectomy, but more for CRPS or radiculopathies.